Hey there, welcome to the Drawing Codex. In this video, what we're going to do is discuss comic books and the comic book style that you choose, whether you go for something detailed or simple, and how that affects your process, the amount of time it takes, and to a certain degree, your mental sanity when you have to deal with the patience that comes up when you have to create larger, more detailed, more nuanced pages. This is actually in response to a comment that someone left on one of my previous videos talking about comic books and how long pages take. I think this is a really interesting topic. Again, I have been a professional comic book artist and I draw stuff all day, every day for a living. Let's dive in and see if we can answer this, and in the process discuss a lot about comics, style, and how they affect you, the artist. Let's get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex again. My name's Mcburnie, and here on this channel I'm all about helping you draw cool stuff from your imagination, which is something that you sort of do a lot in comics, how to embrace the challenge of drawing, how to get professional results, and how to master the craft of line and color illustration. So this is in response to a question. The question is as follows, and I'll just read it out. Thank you for this video. Right now I'm currently struggling with finding the right style for comics that is something I'd be happy with, but at the same time would be reasonable to do time-wise. A current problem I have is that I like to draw lines/line art because I started drawing with fine liner pens for years, but at the same time I find I like to digitally color like a painter would, and I just don't really like the look of that flat toon shading. However, because of this, I often run into the problem that the image as a whole either needed more work to at least get it to an acceptable level, or that I put way too much time into it that wouldn't be sustainable for a comic making career. I can't seem to manage a middle ground. I'm sorry if this ends up kind of vague, but do you have any insight for this problem? I sure do. Now, the reason I do is because I personally have struggled with this quite a bit. As you may know from looking at this channel, I do sort of quite a wide range of different art styles. You know, I've drawn comic books, which, you know, kind of are in that sort of line and color style. And I'll talk about, you know, the evolution of some of those styles that I used on the different books. But, you know, I've also, you know, like painted a lot of stuff for illustration. And I really started with a very similar sort of conundrum. And firstly, it was just that I actually wanted to sort of pencil, ink, draw, color, write, letter. I wanted to do the whole book. And in the Western system, that was kind of challenging. And a big part of this question, I think, is very much linked to publishing schedules, or as you're saying, what is reasonable from a production level, and, you know, to make sure that that will work for a career. Now, I personally sort of grew up not really, like, I wanted to draw comics, but I wasn't sort of particularly attached to any style. I liked painting, I liked fantasy art, I liked a whole bunch of things, and in my mind I kind of wanted to combine these. Now, there's lots of examples of very, very detailed comic book art, and I've sort of said before, if you look at a lot of the you know, the big sort of French albums and things that I sort of grew up reading, and I was exposed to a lot of the typical translations that were around in the late 90s from like heavy metal books and those kind of things. But the point is that there are industries and ways of sort of you creating art professionally that will allow you to spend quite a lot of time on a page and really make it look amazing. So one of the ways that I kind of solved this for myself is getting into the French comic book industry, which basically allowed me that 4 to 5 days to finish a page. But this issue of the style, I think, was still a problem for me. And although, again, I wanted to render and add a lot of that sort of painterly detail, and almost, again, I was sort of a little bit obsessed with trying to sort of mix up styles and use different things. And I think I actually have transitioned to a much sort of flatter, sort of toon shaded sort of comic book style currently. And a big reason for that is specifically that that allows me to create more comic book pages in the same amount of time. But I really struggled with that early on. Now, I think this is just generally quite a conundrum that can come up, because if you have styles and ways of creating stuff currently, again, you might like video game art, you might like illustration, and there's a strong feeling that like you like this thing, right? You have a real passion for it, and you also like comics. And the question is sort of, how can you combine these? How can you do what's natural? If you haven't drawn a huge amount of comics though, it's tricky to know how to actually meld those styles together. And it's also tricky to understand why some of those styles exist in the first place. And that's really what I want to address here in this first sort of point that I can use to try and answer this question. That is, why are a lot of comic books heavily stylized to begin with? To my mind, style has a number of different elements. One is that we have certain idiosyncrasies that we can just sort of have as an artist. You have a particular line style, right? You might be thinking that some people only use straight lines. Some people only use curved, flowy lines. Some people like to draw things simpler. Some people like to draw things with a lot of texture or sort of hatching. Now, there's also the more subtle, just little things that we will do as artists, the little inflections of the pen, little tweaks here and there, mistakes. Again, things that I would label as an idiosyncratic style. They're things that are very personal to you. The other sort of element of style here that I think we can look at is the functional level of style. Now, this is where, again, we're more thinking about things like, what medium are we creating in? What is the function of this art? Who is looking at it? And what is the natural way that our process and our creation will create art that sort of fits in that groove? And the style, I think you will find, often flows from that functional need. So let me give you a few examples. One would be that the superhero comic is known originally for very bright colors. And stylistically, you could say, well, that's just an interesting choice. Bright colors are bombastic, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of drama. The reason that they're so bright and they're so day glow in the beginning is because of the technical limitations of the coloring, however. In most cases, the reason that Superman is bright red and bright blue is because it's cheaper to have your main character be made up of those primary colors, or not necessarily primary colors, but your basic like CMYK, right? Whatever colors are on the plate. And mixing them actually involved quite a complicated technical process of separating out different sort of halftone sort of patterns, and so that you would have mixing of those colors. And that's just expensive because you literally had to cut out twice as many masks, right? And all those things were done by hand. So if you look at the reason that a lot of those colors were chosen, there was a massive financial reason for that. You can see a similar concept happen with Disney when Disney was originally creating the character designs. And I think, again, this is one of those little anecdotes that I found fascinating, but they sort of figured out that if they added like an extra button to a character design, it kind of cost $20,000 over the entire production. So just redrawing, right? If you think about it, there's two buttons, right? They cost sort of $20,000 each to the production budget in general to have, hundreds of people just redrawing those things. And three costs sort of $60,000, right? And so you can imagine that probably 0 buttons is better from a financial standpoint. If you really need a button, you have to prove it. You have to justify the need. Now, the entire style of the Disney animation look, which really did inspire a lot of comic book looks as well, because that style sort of, stemmed from illustration that was being done around the 20s and 30s. But again, there's a lot of technical reasons that the style of that sort of Disney animation looked like it did. There were technical limitations that were placed upon it. You can also see the whole concept of creating line illustrations is very much based off what prints well. So you could just sort of draw a pencil drawing, and prior to the printing press, right, and the need to reproduce illustrations, in many ways, in many cases, you would just draw in whatever medium you wanted. But once you sort of realized what would reproduce well on a printing press or a lithographic press or whatever sort of medium people are using, people start to create art to fit the production process, because you sort of create something and then you realize, you know what, if I make this more graphic, if I simplify the lines, if I sort of figure out what works when I'm creating the initial artwork and how that's going to affect the finished printed product, that will make it look better. And so the style happens from a functional standpoint, and that's how you get these things sort of happening as they are now. There's no functional reason to do line art at all. There's no reason to have line art plus coloring in a comic book style. The reason that this is sort of exists is because you layer on technical, functional limitations upon the artistic look and optimizations that people do over the years and decades and centuries. But then through that process, you kind of find things that look good, because often technical limitation will make things look interesting. So another example would be if you look at your typical modern sort of Western comic book coloring style. Here's X-Men by John Cassaday and Joss Whedon, and I think this is colored by Laura Martin, right? And so you can see that, again, you know, that there's quite a lot of rendering here. But, you know, I'm very sure that there's a massive amount of efficiency as it goes into creating the comic book coloring look. But again, this entire style, the idea of doing lines plus colors underneath, is completely irrelevant. You don't need to do it that way. You could paint it. You could do it any which way you want. But because we found these interesting styles and interesting ways of doing things, there's often a little bit of magic there. The style has a lot of sort of reason to exist, and I think, as we'll talk about a little bit later, there's often a lot of wisdom as to why it was created that way that is good to pay attention to. But the bottom line here is that style is made up of multiple parts, and one could be your deepest personal idiosyncratic, the way you hold the pen, right? It's the mistakes you make as you hold it. It's those little things that really define your style, and it's as much a matter of your handwriting as your art, as the way you think. It's very personal. The next layer of style, which I think is what your question is really directed at, is, should I paint this? Should I use flat color? Should I use a simpler coloring style? And that's really where we have to consider function. And the deadline is a major part of the function. And this is where, again, you have to make choices that are based on functionality. And I think what you have to do is allow the structure and the functionality, the medium, the audience, the schedule, the economics of it. You have to understand that artists have always worked within those structures, and that the reason you often see very interesting styles emerge is because people get put under that systematic stylistic pressure and they come out with very interesting solutions. And often creativity and very interesting things are created from a lot of constraint. And I think maybe what you're experiencing is sort of a lack of that constraint and a million different options. And it can be very sort of tricky to know, what do I do? What do I aim for? But at its core, we need to understand that style is a product of functionality, of economics, of very sort of harsh limitations that often force us to come up with creative solutions. As I said, often those creative solutions are a little bit magical. Just quickly, if you're interested in learning and developing your own line and color style in Photoshop, I have a free quick start guide that goes over my general advice for creating the type of line and color illustrations that I create in Photoshop, how to develop a simple process, how to just get in there and start creating art. It goes over a lot of my advice for how to develop your own process and your own style, going from the thumbnail to the finished product. Go check it out. It's free. The link will be in the description. All right, so let's look at the difference between a more painted, detailed style versus a flat, simpler style. Now, as I've said, hopefully you understand that the style is part choice, part not choice. Part of it is something that's imposed upon us. Now, I kind of started out, as I said, being a little bit of a mix of everything. I'd be painting, I'd be drawing, but I didn't want to do traditional penciling and inking and sort of that traditional Western coloring. But, I did often see these big European books, and I sort of knew that it was possible to create these kind of big pages. And so what I'd say is at its core, if you do want to spend that 5 days on a page, I think it's really just a matter of sort of trying to figure out how you can make that work from a career standpoint. Now, that's probably the subject of another video. And if anyone wants me to make another video, if you have a specific question, just let me know. I'm super happy to answer questions like this. But just know that it is possible. Your career looks different. And if you're interested in writing these stories, you really do have to understand how to compress a story and get the most out of those detailed pages. You have to think about it a little bit less as kind of a pulp era serial drama where you're creating manga style throwaway content where the mangaka, you can see, is obviously just doesn't know what's going to happen that week, so they kind of have some two characters kind of just like looking at each other before they fight, and you're kind of like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's often because they don't know what's going to happen next, and so they sort of have to put in some episode, right? You can see that with a lot of mediums, right? There's a pace to it, and it's interesting. And in my opinion, that creates very, very good content, right? Creates really, really amazing stories to have it sort of super decompressed, and to be able to explore different ideas and have the pace of the art be so fast that it really doesn't matter if you sort of linger on a particular point, if you expand something in time, if you go down a little rabbit hole, because it's interesting and overall, the story is massive and expansive. That's not what you're going to be doing if you pick a really detailed, painted style. What you're going to have to focus on is almost thinking of creating a finished movie script. Something that is highly, highly polished, very slick, that has, very defined beginning, middle, and end. The story has to have a lot of power, and it has to really push you to pick it up, right? To sort of buy this thing and then kind of want to own it and go back and read it again. It can't just be sort of throwaway art. It has to be a story that has impact and lasting appeal, and it has to sort of justify being printed into something that's a little bit more special. Again, these books often only have 46 pages, and that's just double what a typical American sort of like Western style artist is going to be able to create in a few months, whereas this is a year-long endeavor. And not to mention your sort of typical sort of manga pace, which again is probably like 20 pages a week. So it's all just a matter of figuring out where you want to sit there and understanding what will follow that, because you can say, oh, I have unlimited choice, and this is where the idea of style and restriction comes in. You can say, oh, I have unlimited choice, but you don't. Because as soon as you choose to create a much more detailed style that is going to take a lot longer to create, you have other restrictions that come onto you, like those ones that I just mentioned, i.e. having to find an industry to work within. and having to figure out how to compete in that industry, because it's easy to say that that's maybe what you want to do, but the question is, well, can you get to the level of quality that other really, really great artists can get in a longer amount of time? Can your rendering be really good? Can your painted style of coloring really elevate the art? Can it be, really, really high quality? Because that's what you're going to have to do. But I think certainly from my experience, I can sort of talk you through a little bit of that sort of journey that I had, going from, again, going from really wanting to spend a lot more time on a page and sort of transitioning a little bit more to a simpler, sort of more reliable, flat coloring style. So when I started, as I said, I was interested in painting, and I was pursuing sort of different career options, right? Concept art, illustration, comics. Wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I didn't have a lot of good career opportunities just kind of sitting about. I didn't live in France. Didn't speak French. I don't sort of live in Europe. I was very far away from that. The internet was not good at that time. So I was developing a lot of different styles. And when I got the first book that I sort of ever illustrated, you can kind of see this. You can kind of see that in the beginning, the style is actually a lot more painted. So you can kind of see there, it's actually like quite a lot more painted than I sort of ended up. So that's sort of maybe the fourth page that I actually did like in time. The first page that I did sort of as a test page was sort of this one here, if we can sort of get it in focus. There we go. So this was kind of what I was working with, and this was very much based off a mix, as you can kind of see, of sort of painting under the lines, mixing things around, and that was kind of my dream. I was like, well, this will be interesting. It'll be kind of painted, kind of done with line. So let's fast forward to some of the later sort of pages, and what you can kind of see here, if we can sort of get that in focus, yeah, kind of about there. So you can see that I've gotten a lot more sort of clean. I've gotten a lot better at creating comic book pages, because this book took me quite a long time to create. See if we can just get it in sort of focus, yeah. And the other thing is I've drastically simplified the rendering. I've made it less painterly. There's still form, there's still detail there, but it's verging a little bit more to kind of a simple flat color with a shading pass, with a tonal, sort of shadow pass, essentially, and a little bit more rendering. So the reason that I kind of transitioned from doing one to the other is I just found that the line and color style with the simpler, sort of less painterly stuff tended to print better. It was just cleaner. When we were doing test prints, I found that it sort of worked a lot better. And I think this is sort of generally my sort of advice that I try and impart to you, is that there's a lot of wisdom to keeping the style a little bit simpler, especially if you're already sort of simplifying things like I was, and going with a flatter color look, because the efficiency of it was what sort of allowed me to get on track with the schedule. So you can see that, again, what happened to a certain degree is I would have ideas in the beginning about how I was going to tackle a project like this, and I'd get really excited about it. And what I would find is that the sheer act of actually doing it and having to get the pages done on time kind of actually was formatting me and pushing me more towards what a typical sort of comic would look like, right? Again, I'm being very general, right? Because lots of people break out of these sort of boundaries and do sort of drastically different things. But that was interesting to me. And I think it's just that the simplicity of focusing on, nice, clean lines, clean color was a lot sort of easier for me. I found it was more reliable, and a lot of that sort of trying to paint things was, it was just sort of not always working in all of the situations that I kind of wanted. So I made that sort of transition, right? And I went from being, again, trying to sort of paint things to being a little bit simpler. And again, that's generally sort of how I view it. Now, there's lots and lots of examples of people who don't do that though, right? So, the classic sort of example that, often sort of gets printed and sort of shown in the Western market is something like sort of Black Sad. And, that's this sort of thing where, you have all of the pages are kind of, let's see if we can get that in focus. Yeah, are kind of, done traditionally with watercolor. And, this is just an amazing, amazing, amazing book. And it's sort of known for being like what people look at when they sort of talk about a European book and, this European book being hyper detailed, right? You just kind of look at that. And, if you look at how these are made, you understand that there's a lot of work that goes into that. It doesn't just happen by itself. And, maybe in some ways, some of these are sort of going to be taking longer than your 5 days per page. I don't know. But if you look at, some of the how-to, how it was sort of done by these, you can see that there's a lot of, so this is this book, sort of the history of the sort of watercolor. And yeah, this is all the pre-production work that went into this book. And you can see that, pretty much all of those panels that just look so good had, multiple color roughs, right? Multiple, plans, multiple versions of them. And, you can see this book. This is a great book. But yeah, and, the reality is, to get that level of quality, you kind of need to do this, right? You kind of need to go pretty crazy with it and really put in that effort and plan them out. But yeah, I mean, you can see there's multiple, ideas for different sort of versions of the lighting, different sort of color combinations and stuff. Now, again, personally, what I found is that although I like that art, and although I'm capable of painting stuff and I'm capable of doing, again, professional sort of ish. Again, I'm not the best sort of, painted illustrator, right? But, I can do it. I'm at a professional level for that kind of stuff. People will pay me to do that. Again, these are like pretty old World of Warcraft trading cards. But again, and I've got a lot of sort of other examples of stuff like that. But I don't have the patience for that for a comic. I can't compete with Black Sad because I don't have the patience to do that sort of preparatory work to make those things that good, right? That's just me. I know myself. And I've kind of realized that personally, I'm sort of a little bit more interested in the type of storytelling where it's a little bit less compressed. So anyway, enough about me, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea for how, again, personally, I've kind of, changed my view on a lot of those things. And again, where you end up is totally up to you, completely up to you. And you're more than welcome to, pick whatever option. But there are a lot of reasons why these styles exist. So what's a good takeaway here? Again, I've talked through the issue. I'm not sure I've sort of given you some really good advice or guidance if this is something that you're struggling with, or if you are the person who asked the original question. As I said, there's a lot of difference between the art you like and the art that you think you like doing versus the art you actually like doing when you're creating a comic book and you're having to do it at a particular pace or you're having to repeat it. So make sure that when you're sort of assessing what you actually feel like doing, what's your actual sort of deep truth. That's often what I think this is about. It's about us trying to figure out, who am I as an artist? What do I actually want to do? Make sure that you match the actual idea in your head for who you are with you doing the actual thing you want. There's a big difference between liking working on a single illustration and painting it, or adding more painterly coloring that takes a long time, and doing that all year on a comic book. And again, you may find you love it and you just want to have that. There's something really magical about having a finished book that you've put a lot of work into. And even though it might not be the longest book, if it's really amazing, that thing will be with you for years and years and years and years, and you'll always feel good about creating that, if that's the type of art that you actually enjoy creating. So there's a lot of value there. I don't think that, having created a book that's this thick, right, versus having created a book that's that thick will make any difference. What will make the difference is, did you like working on it? And are you proud of it? Are you happy with it? Do you think as a thing it's good? That's what I think you should focus on. But at its core, even if you are rendering, if you want to create art in a production environment, you're going to have to really, really work on efficiency. So if we look at all of those different sort of artistic styles, again, if we go back to a, classic sort of, again, what I would consider like a nice sort of Western American sort of comic book sort of style, there's a lot of efficiency that goes into the rendering here. And I think what I'd recommend is instead is really look at sort of comic book coloring and the techniques and the processes that people use when they're really trying to meet deadlines. And I think you'll be able to create a lot of efficiency, let's say, no matter what style you choose. And I think naturally, if you just do it, if you just start creating those comics and try and find those efficiencies, you will naturally find them. They will naturally work. If you just create comics and sort of set yourself a deadline, you will naturally figure out a lot of these things on your own. That's all I've got for this one. Hopefully this was interesting. I thought it's a lot easier for me to answer this type of question as a fairly long form, laid back answer here. If you've got an additional question or you want clarification on any of this, let me know in the comments below. I'd be more than happy to do this more and make more detailed answers to your questions, because this stuff is, to me, super interesting. That's all I got. Catch you around. Happy drawing.